Okay, this is the crimes of Joe Biden. Well, this is May 17th, about 3 months into the pandemic, and Joe Biden is the presumptive Democratic Party frontrunner. I'm going to give a little rundown, takedown of Joe Biden. So the crimes of Joe Biden. First, there's a title of a famous article which came out in January of this year by Zephyr Teachow. Zephyr Teachow is a leftist lawyer. She's a law professor at Harvard University in New York. In 2014, she ran the Democratic primaries for governor of New York against Andrew Cuomo, lost obviously, but she actually got 34% of the vote. She was the, was I here? Oops. She was the Democratic congressional candidate from the 19th district against District of New York State. She lost to the Republican, and she also ran for New York State Attorney General in 2018, but lost in the Democratic Party primary. Basically, she's an up-and-coming figure, progressive Democratic figure. So far as I know, she hasn't been elected to anything. I wouldn't trust her. I wouldn't trust anyone in the Democratic Party, as I think the trajectory of Bernie Sanders or AOC and others have shown. However, she's an up-and-coming progressive Democratic Party figure. Okay, some stuff about her. She was close to Bernie Sanders. She endorsed him in 2016 when he ran, and Sanders endorsed her in 2018. Anyway, she had an article, fairly famous article, which came out in January 20th of 2020 of this year in The Guardian. It's called "Middle Class Joe Has a Corruption Problem." It makes, It makes him a weak candidate. Kidding. Basically called Biden corrupt. I'd go much further. He's a monstrous candidate, not just corrupt. And she phrased it, he has an electoral problem. I say it goes a lot beyond that. Anyway, this article created a big political uproar. Bernie Sanders actually apologized to the Biden campaign for the article, essentially throwing Zephyr Teachow under the bus, and turned out to be a disastrous move on Sanders' support. His whole campaign, as we know, conformed to what he thought made the Democratic Party leaders happy, basically guaranteeing that he'd lose. He had ample room to attack Biden, and he didn't. Anyway, the article made a huge stir. It's only about a page and a half, it gives links, online version gives links to articles, mostly in The Intercept, detailing how closely intertwined with corporate America and his own donors Biden has been for his entire political career, and it makes him look really horrible. So I'm going to riff on that article somewhat, as well as reference other articles. Zephyr Teachow starts off her article saying, it looks like middle-class Joe has perfected the art of taking big contributions, then representing the corporate donors at the cost of middle and working-class Americans. Converting campaign contributions into legislative favors and policy positions isn't being moderate, Zephyr Teachow says. It's the kind of transactional politics Americans have come to loathe. It's like pay-to-play system, in effect, bribery. Biden has a deeply reactionary agenda, and he's been on the wrong side big time of just about every major issue. For me, it boggles the mind to think that he's possibly any better than Trump, or represents an alternative to Trump. Zephyr Teachow mentions 3 clear examples. There are more, and some things she leaves out, but clear examples: Biden's long, close connection to the finance industry, the medical lobby, and his horrible policy on climate change. Zephyr Teachow also mentions Social Security. Like, for the past 40 years, Biden has energetically sought to cut or privatize Social Security, and the fact that the real estate industry is a big contributor. And she says, mentions Biden's close ties to Big Pharma and the healthcare industry, and she asks, what did all these donors get? A healthcare proposal that preserves the power of the insurance industry and leaves 10 million Americans uninsured. Okay, climate change. Again, there are close ties in. Biden has a horrible program. Again, close ties with donors and lobbyists, despite a pledge not to accept contributions from the oil industry. There are some easy loopholes, and he does anyway. One writer, a writer Zephyr Teachout referred to, said Biden's climate change proposal is a joke. One writer even went as far as grading it, saying Biden's plan is not just a failing grade, but it's parent-teacher conference time. It's really bad. Okay, many things that Zephyr Teachout in an article does not mention. She does not mention the fact that Biden was a key figure in pushing support for Bush's Iraq War. Zephyr Teachout doesn't mention the fact that Biden was a key figure in pushing support for Bush's Iraq War through Congress. He was instrumental in getting it passed, and up to 1 million people were killed. His support for jihadists, his record for support for school segregation. Another writer said that Biden, quote, developed a language for northern suburban opposition to desegregation. And not the least of his crimes, he was instrumental in pushing different iterations of the Patriot Act. Indeed, he basically wrote the Patriot Act, he bragged about it, which increases government surveillance and the powers of the security state. Also, Zephyr Teachout didn't dwell on his role in mass incarceration. There's a Mother Jones article in December 2019 by Tim Murphy called House of Cards. It analyzes Biden's career and discusses his support for finance over working people, his close ties with finance capital. He mentioned that Biden is widely called the senator from MBNA. MBNA was basically a credit card company. It was later bought by Bank of America. The article begins, this Mother Jones article begins here. Joe Biden was settling into his new job in Washington, D.C. in the early 70s. And at the same time, Ralph Nader published a book about Delaware, which was called The Company State, which basically deconstructed what made Delaware unique. What made Delaware unique is that it was fully owned by the DuPont family. And his book, Ralph Nader wrote, just when Biden was starting his career, says the answer, the company state explained, had to do with the unique relationship between government and commerce. Delaware was less of a democracy than a fiefdom, contorting its laws to meet the demands of its corporate lords. I mean, it's true in the United States as a whole, but it was especially true in Delaware. The DuPonts were a very powerful family in Delaware. They basically still own, but owned back then, the state's 2 largest newspapers, employed a tenth of the state's legislature. The governor was a former DuPont executive at the time. The state's member of commerce for most of the 1970s was Pierre Samuel DuPont IV. And Nader said General Motors could buy Delaware if DuPont were willing to sell it. It was wholly connected to the DuPont company. So Joe Biden came out of this political environment. He didn't create the system, but he used his influence to strengthen and protect it. He cast key votes that deregulated the banking industry, made it harder for individuals to escape their credit card debts and student loans, and protected his state's status as a corporate bankruptcy hub, quoting from the Mother Jones article. Okay, in the 1970s and 80s, Delaware was in the doldrums, really hit hard by that bad recession of that period. And when the economy sagged in the late 1970s, the cash-strapped state began looking for ways to supplement its income. In 1981, it passed a new law written by banking lobbyists and backed by DuPont with the hopes of becoming, in the words of the governor who signed it, a DuPont naturally, making Delaware into, quote, the Luxembourg of the United States. While other states were setting caps on usury rates, limits on what interest lenders could charge, Delaware told banks they could charge whatever they wanted in annual interest and late fees. The banks could also foreclose on debtors' homes if they fell behind on payments. The state even cut corporate taxes. The result was a corporate gold rush. A dozen companies, including J.P. Morgan and Chase Manhattan, now J.P. Morgan Chase, opened offices in Delaware in the first year alone. By the late 90s, 4 of the 5 largest credit card firms in the country had set up in Wilmington, and the company employed at least 35,000 people. The company state had pulled off a lucrative turnaround. Over the next 2 decades, as Biden rose through the ranks of the Democratic Party, the state's center of gravity began to shift from the world of chemicals to the big business of other people's business: banking, accounting, law, and telemarketing. But if the industry had changed, the others remained. The ethos remained. Delaware was the company state and owed its prosperity to its willingness to give corporations what they wanted. Though he's now a millionaire thanks to book sales and speaking fees, Biden has long positioned himself as the champion of the middle class. Calls himself Middle Class Joe. He's presented as a scrappy kid from Scranton, Pennsylvania, where he's originally from, who's fought the good fight for decades. His adopted home state is part of that identity too. An unglamorous enclave of scrapple and toll roads, the Acela corridors, flyover country. The Acela corridor is the Amtrak Express from Boston, D.C., like what they used to call Bosch Wash, huge metropolitan corridor in the northeast U.S., and they call it the Acela corridor. So Delaware's the Acela corridor's flyover country, unglamorous place. As Biden pursues his third and likely final quest for the Democratic presidential nomination, I believe he's 77, his record haunts him because the interests of Delaware are often at large with extreme odds with everyone else's. So Biden's career was, this article, I'm reading from the Mother Jones article here, his article was bankrolled by the credit card industry. He delivered for it by spearheading a bankruptcy bill that made it harder for Americans to reduce their debts. And helped cause the financial crisis. He not only authored and voted for that bill, he actually split with Obama and led the battle to vote down the Democratic Party amendments, which would have moderated by. So he's further to the right of the rest of the Democratic Party on this. And Biden also this is not from the article now, but Biden almost single-handedly created the current student loan bubble, which is $1.6 trillion, which is the largest single source of debt for Americans. So from the 1970s to the 1990s, Biden made it easier to take out student loans for large layers of people who, this initially sounds good, but then he made it nearly impossible to escape repayment obligations. You can't get out of student loan debt by bankruptcy. As combined with a stagnant income of millennials, he said in an interview that he has no sympathy for millennials. Why don't they change the system like we did? Yeah, right. He largely created the trap many millennials are in, like people working 3 jobs. They can't pay off horrific student loans. So an article in The Intercept, came out January 7th of this year, describes how the student loan bubble evolved, and Biden is, again, almost single-handedly responsible for it. Joe Biden's role in creating the student debt crisis stretches back to the 1970s by Ada Chavez. Today, more than 44 million, I'm reading from the article, today more than 44 million Americans collectively owe nearly $1.6 trillion in student loan debt, a figure that has surpassed similar numbers for nearly every other form of debt, including credit cards and auto loans. Joe Biden played a key role in creating the situation. Basically, from the 1970s, made taking out student loans to pay for college easier, but from then until 2005, made it difficult or impossible to declare bankruptcy. Back to Zephyr Teashow again. She says, early in his senatorial career, Biden played a role in making it easier for students and parents to take out burdensome loans, spanning across several decades. Later, his trademark bankruptcy reform legislation made it nearly impossible to discharge student loans, birthing a predatory industry and sinking millions into unsustainable levels of debt. And back to the Intercept article, quoting from that, in 1978, Biden supported the Middle Income Student Assistance Act, which eliminated the income restrictions on federal loans to expand eligibility to all students. Biden helped write a separate bill later that year blocking students from seeking bankruptcy protection on these loans after graduation. And within a few years, the crackdown, as on student debtors filing for bankruptcy, that began in 1978 would extend beyond just government loans. In 1984, it says under a bill signed into law by President Ronald Reagan, bankruptcy exemptions were extended to non-higher education loans. So it made it much harder to declare bankruptcy. And the total amount of private student debt more than doubled between 2005 and 2011, growing from $55.9 billion to $140.2 billion, according to the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. A 2011 study from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York found that the 2005 bankruptcy bill led to a surge of foreclosures that may not have happened otherwise, translating to an additional 29,000 foreclosures every 3 months. This was a big contribution to the 2008 crash, with many people being kicked out of their homes. Thanks, Joe Biden. Okay, now, it may sound good, making it easier to get student loans, but there are many other countries, developed countries, have different ways of financing college. Long story, briefly, I worked overseas and I was traveling in China. I was working in China for a time, and I met a student from Poland. As a grad student, and I talked to him. I think he was an undergrad student, and I talked to him for a while. And apparently, there was a lot of students from Poland were really angry because there was a cutback in state subsidies, and the subsidies they lived off of. And I was shocked. You mean you get subsidies? At the time, I had these loans, and I eventually did pay back my student loans, but I had these humongous loans from undergrad and grad school, and I couldn't pay back. I was working in China. I was making $200 a month, which is really good there. You can live really well, but I couldn't really do anything to pay back loans, and I was kind of upset about it. And so anyway, I met this Polish kid who, they were really upset that they're cutting back the state subsidies. Like, what? You actually get? And I found out later other European Union countries, Canada, they do have they have grants. You apply. Canada, you apply for a grant. I mean, they're under the influence of neoliberalism. They've been eroding that a lot, but there are other ways society could pay for higher education for people. Student loan trap is just horrific, and put many people, like stagnant wages for millennials, put many people in a really difficult situation. And Joe Biden is actually almost seriously, it's not exaggerating to say he's almost single-handedly responsible for this. So, okay, continuing here. So another article in The Intercept by Ryan Grimm. He says, I forget the year, but forget when this came out, but indeed, his entire career was pushing for cutting Social Security. And Ryan Grimm says, indeed, Biden has been advocating for cuts to Social Security for roughly 40 years. And after a Republican wave swept Congress in 1994, Biden's support for cutting Social Security and his general advocacy for budget austerity made him a leading combatant in the centrist wing battle against the Democratic Party's retreating liberals in the 1980s and 1990s. Biden said, when I argued that we should freeze federal spending, I meant Social Security as well, Biden said. Very famous statement. He told the Senate in 1995, I meant Medicare and Medicaid. I meant veterans benefits. I meant every single solitary thing in the government. And I not only tried it once, I tried it twice, I tried it a third time, and I tried it a fourth time. And a freeze would have basically reduced the amount that would be paid out, cutting the program's benefit, which Biden really fought for. And Biden was, at the time, expressing a common sentiment among the centrist faction of the Democratic Party in the 1980s and 90s. There's so-called New Democrats. The belief that old tax and spend liberals were out, and the type of new Democrat was needed, one who understood the necessity of fiscal restraint. Cutting spending was the only way, he argued, to to salvage what was left of the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's programs, and the New Deal. The mentality of Biden-style Democrats, Ryan Grimm goes on to say, that the best thing the party could do was play defense, was dominant for a generation. It's now being fundamentally challenged, and not just in the presidential campaign, but in congressional primaries across the country. So yeah, this was Biden's big thing. He was Mr. Austerity. Figures that the only way we can, after Reagan, the only way we can continue to win elections is we have to agree with them. So the mentality of Biden-style Democrats that the best the party could do was play defense. Oh yeah, sorry, I read that already. Biden himself, at least on his campaign website, now supports making Social Security more generous, not less, because he's running for president. But that's at odds with decades of his own advocacy, a record that become a major political liability. And also during this time, Biden was to Reagan's right on cutting Social Security, and efforts date back to the Reagan administration. So one of Ronald Reagan's major moves as president was to implement a mammoth tax cut, corporate tax cut, tilted towards the wealthy, and to increase defense spending. Biden, a Delaware senator at the time, supported both moves. This heightened spending and reduced revenue focused public attention on the debt and deficit, and gave fuel to a push for a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The big mantra was cutbacks, austerity, balanced budget. This was a complete retreat from the earlier New Deal Keynesian system. It was a reaction to the overall broader crisis of capitalism, although I doubt Biden thought of it in those terms. Anyway, in the midst of that debate, according to a Ryan Grimm article, Biden teamed up with Iowa Republican Senator Chuck Grassley to call for a freeze on federal spending and insisted on including Social Security in that freeze, even as the Reagan administration fought to protect the program from cuts. It was part of the Democratic approach at the time, and not just to match Republicans, but to get to their right at times. So, and Biden also did the same thing in criminal justice policy. He was to the right of Reagan on this. So the Biden-Grassley plan was ultimately rejected, but Biden never wavered on it. So that political approach, by ceding to Republicans that they will respond by compromising in return, which never happens, has been thoroughly discredited by the last 40 years of events, though it remains the animating argument in Biden's campaign. Okay, so mass incarceration. And he played a famous role in the 1994 omnibus, what's called the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill under Clinton. It's well known, but what's not as well known is his earlier efforts in the same role under Reagan. It's called, another article, The Untold Story, Joe Biden Pushed Ronald Reagan to Ramp Up Incarceration, Not the Other Way Around. An article by David Stein, September 17th of 2019. I believe it's from The Intercept. Don't quote me on this, but the article says, the politics of race relations have been a central part of Biden's career, from his high-profile opposition to busing to his authoring of the 1994 Biden crime bill. When he talks about his criminal justice record on the campaign trail, the untold story. Joe Biden pushed Ronald Reagan to ramp up incarceration, not the other way around. By David Stein, September 17th, 2019. I believe it's from The Intercept. Don't quote me on this. But it says, the politics of race relations have been a central part of Biden's career, from his high-profile opposition to busing to his authoring of the 1994 Biden crime bill. When he talks about, the article says, when he talks about his criminal justice record on the campaign trail, he argues today that the focus on the 94 bill is unfair because the real rise in mass incarceration happened at the state level and it was long underway by then. Okay, well, Biden is correct that the surge began in the 70s of mass incarceration and accelerated in the 80s, but a closer look at his role reveals that it was Biden who was among the principal and earliest movers of this policy agenda that would become the war on drugs and mass incarceration. And he did so. He pushed for this in the face of initial reluctance from none other than President Ronald Reagan. So Biden was to the right of Reagan on this. Indeed, Reagan even vetoed a signature piece of Biden legislation, which he drafted with arch segregationist Strom Thurmond of South Carolina to create, quote, a federal drug czar. And Biden was close friends with Strom Thurmond, went to his funeral. Funny, Biden was too right-wing for Reagan. Strom Thurmond, arch segregationist, and he was a close friend of Strom Thurmond, as I said. At the time, many Republicans were hesitant about increasing federal spending, and in fact looking for ways to slash the budget. Domestically, Reagan wanted to focus on cutting taxes and reducing social welfare spending, and had little interest in an expansive federal spending program geared towards building new prisons and hiring new police. He didn't want to spend the money. Biden, on the other hand, was a key policy leader among both parties on this issue. So, and the article goes on to say Biden, and later, in the late Carter administration, was criticizing Carter for not fighting the war on drugs forcefully enough. We're trying to alarm the policymakers, Biden told the Washington Post months before the 1980 election. I'm not saying that business as usual won't work. Although mass imprisonment is and was primarily driven by states, at the federal level, Biden shaped the punitive political culture of the 1980s and 90s by reviving a policy agenda that was briefly in decline at the end of the 1970s. In 3 years under Carter, the federal prison population fell by a quarter, even as it was rising at the state level. But by the final days of the Carter administration, the federal program that provided resources to states for policing and imprisonment, the law enforcement assistance, By the final days of the Carter administration, the federal program that provided responses to states, the federal assistance, was increased. Biden said, give me the crime issue, and you'll never have trouble with it in an election. Biden was said to have begged party leadership during meetings. With his new position of power on the committee, Biden began to shape its agenda accordingly. Later, in 1989, Biden criticized President George Bush's anti-drug efforts as not tough enough, bold enough, or imaginative enough. The president says he wants to wage a war on drugs, but if that's true, what we need is another D-Day, not another Vietnam and a limited war fought on the cheap. Then in 1994, Biden pushed through the massive crime bill, which authorized more than $30 billion of spending, largely devoted to expanding state prisons and local police forces. And of course, 40 years we know the war on drugs obviously hasn't worked. It's been pretty obviously a war on poor people. It's a war against black people and other minorities. Just read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Old style Jim Crow segregation has disappeared, but mass incarceration has taken its place. Anyway, the article goes on to say that Biden bragged of his accomplishments in the 1994 report. The first national drug strategy sought a total of $340 million in federal aid to state and local law enforcement, with states matching the federal assistance dollar for dollar. The first drug strategy I offered in January 1990 called for more than $1 billion in aid to states and local law enforcement, a controversial view at the time. As Biden pushed Republicans to spend more on policing and prisons, he was part of a wave of New Democrats pushing the party in ever more punitive directions. Now, with upward of 1 in every 2 families in the U.S. having suffered the harms of mass incarceration, Biden says he worries that too many people are incarcerated. This was all, kind of after the fact. Okay, so. Yeah, anyway, as I said, what's called the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 was passed in the wake of some high-profile violence. The Waco siege, which the federal government really screwed up in 1993, and what's called the California street shooting, a mass shooting. And followed these events, other profile instances of violent crime. This act expanded federal law in several ways, greatly expanded death penalty offenses. And if you ask criminal justice reform activists, the '94 crime bill passed by Congress and signed by President Bill Clinton, which meant to reverse decades of rising crime, was one of the key contributions to mass incarceration in the '90s. They say it led to more prison sentences, more prison cells, and more aggressive policing, especially hurting Black and brown Americans who are disproportionately likely to be incarcerated. There's a war against poor people, a war against black people, and Hispanic people. And then Biden finally admitted well after the fact this was a mistake while he's running for president, conveniently. Okay, so a big one. Biden was, of course, a very big supporter of the Iraq War, not mentioned in the Zephyr Teashout article. And Biden didn't just support going to war with Iraq in 2003. He was instrumental in getting congressional approval for it. Article in The Guardian of February 17th of this article by Mark Weisbrot. Biden did vastly more than just vote for the war in Iraq, yet his role in bringing about that war remained mostly unknown or misunderstood by the public. When the war was debated and authorized by the U.S. Congress in 2002, Democrats controlled the Senate and Biden was chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Biden himself had enormous influence as chair and strongly argued in favor of the 2002 resolution granting President Bush the authority to invade Iraq. And Biden said, "I do not believe this is a rush to war." Biden said a few days before the vote, "I believe it is a march to peace and security. I believe that failure to overwhelmingly support this resolution is likely to enhance the prospects that war will occur." Of course, usual Orwellian language, and enhance the prospect. His voting for this resolution enhanced this prospects for war. But he had a power much greater than his own words. Biden was able to choose all 18 witnesses in the main Senate hearings in Iraq, and he mainly chose people who supported a pro-war position. They argued in favor of regime change as a stated U.S. policy and warned of a nuclear-armed Saddam sometime in this decade. That Iraqis would welcome the United States as liberators, and that Iraq permits, quote, permits known al-Qaeda members to live and move freely about in Iraq, and that they are being supported, which Biden said is all complete nonsense. And is well known to be nonsense, too. The lies about al-Qaeda were perhaps the most transparently obvious of the falsehoods created to justify the Iraq War. As anyone familiar with this subject matter could testify, Saddam Hussein ran a secular government out of hatred, which was mutual, for religious extremists like al-Qaeda. But Biden did not choose from among the many expert witnesses who would have explained that to the Senate and to the media. Biden's selling points as a candidate often lead with his reputation for foreign policy experience and knowledge, but Iraq in 2002 was already devastated by economic sanctions, had no weapons of mass destruction, and was known by even the most pro-war experts to have no missiles that could come close to the United States. The idea that this country on the other side of the world posed a security threat to America was more than far-fetched. The idea that the United States could simply invade, topple the government, and take over the country without provoking enormous violence was also implausible. It's not clear how anyone with foreign policy experience and expertise could have believed these ideas. And the article goes on to say Senator Dick Durbin, who sat on the Senate Intelligence Committee at the time, was astounded by the difference between what he was hearing there and what was being fed to the public. He said the American people were deceived into this war. And regardless of Biden's intentions, which I make no claim to know or understand, the resolution granting President Bush the authority to start the war, which Biden pushed through the Senate, was a major part of that deception. So too was the restricted testimony that Biden allowed. The resolution itself contained deceptive language about a number of pretexts for the war, including al-Qaeda and weapons of mass destruction that Iraq did not have. So, an article in 2006 from The Atlantic says in 2006, Biden, made a full-on push to, this happened later on, Biden made a full-on push to carve Iraq into 3 separate semi-autonomous regions, saying the idea that the Iraqi people would unite behind a strong central government was fundamentally and fatally flawed. The article says that the jury's still out on whether Iraqis can rally behind the central government, but it's safe to say that he's no longer pressing for a soft petition while inside the Obama White House, so Biden gave up on the idea as vice president. Now, dividing Iraq into 3 separate areas, essentially separate countries, was the opposite of Arab nationalism. The Arab nationalist movement from the 50s to the 1970s, at least, was a project to unite Arab countries beyond the artificial boundaries which Western colonialists imposed on them, the famous Treaty of Sykes-Picot, and develop their economy for their own needs. Part of the U.S. project is working against that, the exact opposite, balkanize and divide, and Biden's plan completely fits into it, and most likely would have precipitated horrific ethnic cleansing, which to some extent has happened anyway, but it could have accelerated it. And who are we to tell Iraq what to do? So, okay, another thing Biden's horrible on is healthcare. Here we go, healthcare. Article by Matt Bruenig from the People's Policy Project, July 15th of last year, says the Biden care system will kill, he estimates the Biden care system will kill 125,000 through uninsurance. And the article says, more generally, Biden's plan has the same problem as any other plan that does not create a national health insurance system. It creates enormous amounts of insurance churn and instability, further eviscerating people when they face hardships, like loss of a job, loss of a spouse, loss of Medicaid due to income increase, and every other negative life event. So the most remarkable thing about Biden's plan is that it does not even aim to provide universal insurance coverage. The more moderate wing of the Democratic Party has mostly been putting out plans that purport to achieve universal coverage, like auto enrollment mechanisms, without national health insurance. But Biden is literally doubling down on, quote, preserving Obamacare by preserving a class of uninsured people. Like, we've had Obamacare for years now. There's still 30 million people uninsured, and Obamacare was a Republican plan. It's Romney care, really. Basically, it preserves the horrible insurance, horrible private insurance industry. People's medical insurance, health insurance are connected to their employer. If they lose a job or relationship with a spouse or whatever, they're screwed, they're unemployed. It's really a horrific system. And the article makes a persuasive case that will happen. So Obama's campaign claims that the plan will leave around 3% of Americans uninsured. These sorts of estimates should be taken with a grain of salt. It's very uncertain how people will respond to the reforms. And Matt Bruenig points to CBO, Congressional Budget Office, initially estimated that 22 million Americans would sign up for insurance on the Obamacare exchanges, but only half that number actually did. So even if you suppose that Biden's estimate is right, and the uninsurance rate goes to 3%, that still implies an enormous amount of unnecessary death caused by a lack of insurance. One commonly used estimate, Matt Bruenig says, states that one unnecessary death occurs annually for every 830 uninsured people. This means that during the first 10 years of Biden care, over 125,000 unnecessary deaths will occur from uninsurance, and this does happen. Bruenig goes through the numbers, and he makes sense. Anyone opposing national health care and working to block is basically guilty of murder, which would include Biden. On April 25th, the day he announced his campaign, Biden went straight to a fundraiser which was co-hosted by the chief executive of a major health insurance corporation. Now, an article, April 25th, 2019, article by Li Fang in The Intercept, Biden talks about Biden's close ties with corporate lobbyists, notably for the healthcare industry. Article described as an upcoming fundraiser, which was rife for Biden, which was rife with lobbyists. But these lobbyists are not registered as federal lobbyists. There's loopholes. A guy named Daniel Hilferty, who has close ties with Biden, hosted this fundraiser. He's actually the Chief Executive Officer of Independence Blue Cross. He's on the board of America's Health Insurance Plans, the trade association working to defeat the progressive push for health Medicare for all. In national politics, Hilferty has exclusively donated to Republicans in this year. Records show the health insurance executive, this guy, gave $5,000 to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, along with smaller donations to other congressional Republicans. But this time he's hosting he hosted a fundraiser for Biden. Another guy, David Cohen, who was another host of this fundraiser, the article Li Fang described, a Comcast executive who oversees the telecom giant's lobbying operation. He's also cut big checks to Republican candidates while pushing to advance his company's regulatory agenda. So Li Fang points out that Biden has long since been close to lobbyists. Biden's presidential campaign is currently being coordinated by his former chief of staff, a guy named Steve Ricchetti, who was himself a lobbyist in the past. Ricchetti's role with Biden's vice presidential office actually sidestepped the Obama administration's ban on employing lobbyists, and Ricchetti received a special waiver to take on his role with Biden. This lobbyist Ricchetti has a long history with Biden. And Biden also refuses to sign a pledge to reject money from insurance and pharma executives and continues to raise money from healthcare industry donors. His campaign is being bankrolled by a super PAC run by healthcare lobbyists. And okay, another thing is Biden and the security state. And okay, so another article in BuzzFeed, the many occasions Joe Biden took credit for writing the Patriot Act by Andrew Kaczynski in BuzzFeed. Another potential sticking point for liberals. Biden not only voted for the 2001 Patriot Act, he on many occasions claimed credit for writing it. Biden said, "I drafted a terrorism bill after the Oklahoma City bombing." Biden was quoted as saying by the New Republic in 2001. It's a bit debatable whether he actually wrote it, but he claims to have written it. And the bill, Biden goes on to say, the bill John Ashcroft sent up was my bill. Biden continued. And the bill John Ashcroft sent up was my bill. Biden continued, referring to the Patriot Act. The bill broadened the surveillance capabilities of U.S. law enforcement agencies as it relates to identifying potential terrorists, and many of its provisions have been opposed by liberal Democrats and civil libertarians. And Biden's record on privacy issues extends back to at least 1994, when as a U.S. Senator from Delaware, he introduced what's called the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA. And it basically requires telecom carriers and manufacturers to design the equipment and services to ensure that they were accessible to surveillance by law enforcement. It was later expanded to cover broadband internet and VoIP traffic. CALEA also forces communications equipment manufacturers like Apple or Samsung to hand over software and hardware designs to law enforcement with a warrant. So another article gives more details on this. It's Joe Biden's record on privacy may give Democrats pause, by Kate Patrick from Inside Sources. So the article says, in response to the Oklahoma City terrorist bombing in 1995, Biden introduced the Omnibus Counterterrorism Act of 1995. Congress never voted on the bill, but Biden said the controversial 2001 USA Patriot Act, which allows the FBI to wiretap and search American citizens' phone calls, emails, and financial records without a court order, copied his 1995 bill. I don't know if that's possible, but during the George Bush presidency, the issue of government surveillance became more partisan, and Biden walked back his views. In 2006, Biden joined his fellow Democrats in vehemently condemning surveillance policies of the Bush administration, and their comments which came back to haunt him when the Electronic Frontier Foundation juxtaposed them with comments from President Obama in 2013 defending his administration's mass surveillance policies. And there are more examples of controversial privacy-based legislation sponsored by Biden. In '91, he introduced the Comprehensive Counterterrorism Act and Violent Crime Control Act, both of which included anti-encryption language that privacy activists argued effectively banned encryption. Some industry observers described Biden as a, quote, net neutrality skeptic, a motion reinforced when his first campaign event after entering the race was a fundraiser at the home of a Comcast lobbyist. When Biden didn't take money from Silicon Valley as a senator, most of his funding came from law firms. His track record indicates that he would likely follow in the footsteps of Bush and Obama when it comes. Another thing Biden was really awful on is abortion rights. He opposed Roe v. Wade in 1974. Biden defeated a 1977 amendment that would have removed all restrictions on federal funding of abortions. Biden voted for a conservative constitutional amendment. At the time, the National Abortion Rights League called this amendment the most devastating attack yet on abortion rights that would allow individual states to overturn Roe v. Wade. In the early 1980s, this bill actually never made it to the full Senate. It came up a second time. Biden voted against it. He crafted what's called the Biden Amendment, which banned U.S. aid from being used for biomedical research related to abortions. So a Salon article by Natasha Leonard says Biden is a disaster for abortion rights. For much of Biden's career, has been a qualified and compromised support of abortion's legality at best and a commitment to limiting funding for abortions at worst. Up until last summer, Biden supported which in 2019, supported the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits federal funding for abortion under programs like Medicaid, enforcing a hideous denial of affordable care to poor people. As vice president, Biden actively worked to undermine reproductive rights by trying to cut mandated coverage for contraception from the Affordable Care Act. His reversal on the Hyde Amendment last year, meanwhile, smacked of electoral expediency. On June 15th, Biden's campaign in 2019, Biden's campaign said that he continued to support the law. He received immediate censure from activists, other lawmakers, and his opponents for the Democratic nomination. The very next night at a Democratic National Committee gala in Atlanta, Biden then said he no longer supported the ban on federal funding for abortions. Yeah, quick turnaround there. And his record on reproductive rights doesn't sound good. Okay, another thing he's really bad at, trade agreements. He was a big supporter of NAFTA and the TPP. In the Senate, Biden voted for the North American Free Trade Agreement and permanent normal trade relations with China. As then President Barack Obama's number 2, he supported the Trans-Pacific Partnership, often called NAFTA on steroids, which was intensely unpopular. In an article in Politico, it says Biden's advocacy for NAFTA and the TPP would suggest that the Washington-driven conventional wisdom that he has solid support among union households in the Midwest and elsewhere might be more complicated than the media is currently presenting, said Waleed Shahid, communications director for the left-wing Justice Democrats. Biden hasn't been held accountable for his policy record, and he'll increasingly be exposed for not really being the populist hero he likes to present himself as. LGBT rights. Biden opposed same-sex marriage for decades, literally. He voted for DOMA, which was the Defense of Marriage Act under Bill Clinton. DOMA actually was a law allowing states to not recognize same-sex marriages made in other states. And Biden also supported the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, banning openly gay from being in the military, although his campaigns actually says he didn't support it, but he did. And he was criticized for calling homophobic Mike Pence, vice president, a decent guy, which he isn't. Biden publicly changed his position in an interview and Meet the Press in 2012 interview, and where previously he opposed it, he evolved like Obama as long as it was politically expedient. for him. Segregation was a huge part of Biden's career. Article in Jacobin called Joe Biden the Anti-Busing Democrat by Branko Marcetic. Biden called busing the, quote, the atom bomb of anti-discrimination weapons and worked to stop busing in his home state, calling it the single most devastating issue that could occur in Delaware. So in 1975, Biden put forward an anti-busing provision that barred the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare from using federal funds to, quote, assign students or teachers by race. Broad language that actually barred the department from taking anti-segregation actions beyond just busing. So the amendment was meant to be a softer alternative to one put forward by Hall of Fame racist and Biden friend Jesse Helms, who was a famous right-wing senator. A version Biden had actually initially supported. He initially supported the Jesse Helms version. Still, the New York Times at the time charged that Biden's supposedly more moderate alternative would signal, quote, a major crumbling of federal determination to achieve equal justice, and called it a real threat not only to the gains of the 60s, but to decency in this society. So he was arch segregationist. The fact that the measure started getting vocal support from various bigots, the article says, quickly became embarrassing for Biden. Yet it didn't stop him from using rhetoric that could best be described as politely racist. Biden claimed that legitimate desegregation was only supposed to cure de jure or explicitly racist segregation. The amendment was meant to be a softer alternative to one put forward by Hall of Fame racist and Biden friend Jesse Helms, a version Biden had actually initially supported. He supported a much more tougher version, but still the New York Times at the time charged that Biden's supposedly more moderate alternative would, quote, signal a major crumbling of federal determination to achieve equal justice, and called it a real threat not only to the gains of the 60s, but to decency in this society. The fact that the measure started getting vocal support from various bigots quickly became embarrassing for Biden. Yet it didn't stop him from using rhetoric that could best be described as politely racist. Biden claimed that legitimate desegregation was only supposed to cure de jure or explicitly racist segregation, and that in some of its forms it was integration that was actually racist and insulting. Anti-segregationists, he charged, were saying that your black curly-haired son has to be in the same class with my white straight-haired one before he can get a decent education, adding that I don't feel responsible for my father's sins, only for their sins. This is very common, like reverse racist trope. I'm not responsible for what my ancestors did, or, you know. Okay, by 1975, Biden was boasting that he, quote, made it, if not respectable, said, I made it reasonable for long-standing liberals to begin to raise questions, to raise the questions I've been the first to raise in the liberal community regarding busing. He predicted that liberal holdouts would see the light and switch sides on busing too. Another article that Biden had, quote, developed, says that Biden had, quote, developed the architecture for northern opposition to desegregation. And this wasn't in the Deep South. This was polite northern urban society, not the Deep South. Okay, so one longtime civil rights activist criticized Biden's attempt to make a distinction between de jure and other kinds of segregation, and called his rhetoric glib and drivel, explaining that busing was about getting black kids the educational resources that only flowed to white schools. As we know, black schools are massively underfunded and have been for many, many decades. A coalition of civil rights organizations, including the NAACP, later sued over Biden's amendment. And his amendment was also opposed by civil rights activists. 1 year after this, Biden put forward another bill, this one barring federal judges from ordering busing unless they could prove there was intentional discrimination going on. According to the Post at the time, both pro and anti-busing forces consider it the most far-reaching anti-busing measure to receive serious consideration in the Senate. Although it was voted down, Biden celebrated that the close vote signaled the death toll for Senate support of busing. And there's also the fact that Biden voted again and again for the unsuccessful Helms-Collins Amendment, which would have stopped the Justice Department from defending busing in court. The vote came up for 1980, well after he had won re-election. As an anti-busing crusader, Biden promoted nearly a dozen pieces of legislation aimed at placing strict limits on federal agencies and the court's ability to mandate busing to achieve racial integration in schools. It's from Joe Biden's Garbage Career. An article in Common Dreams by Norman Solomon. It is an inconvenient fact that Biden has a political history of blowing dog whistles for racism. More than ever, the Democratic electorate is repelled by that kind of pitch. If his dog whistling past becomes a major issue, the former vice president and his defenders will face the challenge of twisting themselves into rhetorical pretzels to deny what is apparent from the video records of Biden's oratory on the Senate floor that span the last decade of the 20th century. Yeah, he said some really inflammatory anti-abortion, anti-desegregation speeches on the Senate. And a key question remains, does it matter that Biden was a shrill purveyor of tropes, racist stereotypes, and legislation aimed at African Americans? During pivotal moments in the history of race relations in this country, from the 1970s to the 1990s, Biden's hot air manifested as pitches to white racism. From the onset of his career on Capitol Hill, he even stooped to reaching out to some of the worst segregationist senators from the South to advance his legislative agenda against busing. In 1984, Reed and West recount, Biden joined with South Carolina's arch-racist Strom Thurmond to sponsor the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which eliminated, other things I've talked about this before, but eliminated parole for federal prisoners and limited the amount of time sentences could be reduced for good behavior. He and Thurmond joined hands to push 1986 and 1988 drug enforcement legislation that created the nefarious sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, as well as other draconian measures that implicate him as one of the initiators of what became mass incarceration. So it's likely that no lawmaker did more to bring about the mass incarceration of black people during recent decades than Joe Biden. In an understated account last week, The Hill newspaper reported that Joe Biden was, quote, instrumental in pushing for the '94 crime bill, which critics have said led to a spike in incarceration, especially among African Americans. And, where are we here? Yes, I mentioned he used incendiary language in defending the 1994 crime bill. Biden actually sent a speech to the Senate, said, we must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter, or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized in the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is that they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat my wife, take on my sons. And that was a pretty awful speech. It didn't directly use the N-word, but it strongly implied racism there. And so he likes to portray himself as a friend and ally of black people. His career is totally pandering, but his actual policies are the whole history is deeply racist. So in short, as journalists Kevin Gosztola and Brian Sonnenstein wrote recently, Biden is in a race between his actual past and his PR baloney, which kind of sums it up. And so Biden has a history of racist dog whistles. In the lead up to his 2008 campaign, Biden repeatedly invoked Delaware's history as a slave state to appeal to Southern conservatives, telling a Republican Rotary Club that Delaware only fought with the Union because we couldn't figure out how to get to the South. Article in Business Insider says Biden, throughout his career, has also strongly supported affirmative action, worked to expand voting rights, address workplace discrimination, and introduced the Violence Against Women Act to help victims of domestic violence, and fought to expand the definition of hate crimes. But at the same time, and he worked alongside Obama to champion criminal justice reform. Yeah, to some extent. But I don't think that makes up for the horrific things he's actually done. The Violence Against Women Act was inserted within this, I believe, the 1994 crime bill, and a small progressive thing to mask a really horrible thing, really horrible crackdown. So Biden's lies. So I don't think whatever few ways Biden used to pose himself as a progressive doesn't make up for all the horrible things that he's done. So Biden's lies, and he's lied. He's a habitual pathological liar. The implosion of Biden's 1987 campaign, 1987 Biden Democratic Party primary, Biden was originally considered a strong contender. Reagan had served 2 terms, and the Democrats thought they needed someone who was more aggressive and more macho looking. So Biden, on this speech, he first famously plagiarized the Neil Kinnock speech, the entire speech. And a really good Sean King article talks about this. It says, in 1997, when Joe Biden was running for president for the very first time, his campaign got swallowed up in a swarm of lies that Joe Biden told about himself all over the country. First, Biden was caught plagiarizing a famous speech from British Labour Party leader Neil Kinnock, including parts of the speech that came straight from Kinnock's personal life that simply were not true for Joe Biden. Like, I believe he said that he was the first in his family to go to college, or his wife was the first in her family to go to college, which was nonsense, which is not true. Then Biden plagiarized yet another speech from the late Robert Kennedy, and another from JFK, and another from Hubert Humphrey. You have to understand this was pre-internet, and it was kind of thought that no one would be able to tell. So you can easily look it up, but no one could tell, but they quickly did. So the revelation that Biden was blatantly plagiarizing the whole speech from Neil Kinnock came from the Michael Dukakis, the Dukakis campaign. And Biden lied in situations and even which wasn't necessary or relevant, wrote a Los Angeles reader. So Biden also came out in that campaign that he plagiarized. He wrote in college. He wrote a paper that used 5 pages from a published law review without quotation marks or proper footnote. He was allowed to make up the course, but the final blow for the campaign came from Newsweek unearthed C-SPAN footage of Biden rattling off his academic accomplishments, including saying that he graduated in the top half of his law school, where in fact he ranked 76 out of 85. As Sean King, in his article in his newsletter, said, it's called, the article, January 29th of this year in his newsletter, 2 truths and 31 lies Joe Biden has told about his work in the civil rights movement. He made up massive tall tales. And so Joe Biden paid a price for most of those lies, but he was never fully held to account for the worst of them all. On the backs of people who actually paid an enormous price for being activists and organizers in the civil rights movement, Joe Biden created a completely false narrative of his work and contributions to the movement that persist to this very day. And another article refers to the fact that Biden lied about his participation in the civil rights movement, and the lies grew throughout his campaign. So, Biden said, the vision that I proclaim today is not some pipe dream or mere romanticism. It's nothing less than the legacy of our generation. Biden told delegates to the California Democratic Convention on February 3rd, 1987, when I was 17 years old, like many of you, I participated in sit-ins to desegregate the restaurants and movie houses of Wilmington, Delaware. And Biden goes on to say, in our youth, we changed America. Reading from a script crafted by strategist Pat Cadell. When we marched, we did not march for a 14-point program and a white paper. We marched to change attitudes, whether it was to civil rights or women's rights or the environment or our culture or the ending of the Vietnam War. We profoundly altered the face of this nation. The goal of his candidacy, it said, was to inspire collective action, not the election of me, the election of we. But Sean King goes on Sean King, he said, now, that's when he first believed, that's when Biden first started this, making up stories about himself, and then he just continually elaborated on it more and more. Sean King says, I've counted at least 31 different lies Biden has told about being an activist, organizer, sit-in demonstrator, boycott leader, voter registration volunteer, black church trainee, and more in the civil rights movement. But every single time I dig, I actually find more interviews, more lies, more fabrications, more tales he told to voters, reporters, historians, and more. First, let's start with the two truths. In September of 1987, with his presidential campaign completely consumed by his lies, Biden, with his entire public life in shambles, fell on his sword and told the truth about his lack of work in the civil rights movement. In repeated interviews, campaign events, and national keynote speeches at the Democratic conventions of Maine and California, Biden told wild tales of how he marched, sat in, and boycotted during the civil rights movement, and even went so far as to suggest that he had traveled to Salem and Birmingham with such actions. But with his campaign in tatters, he finally said they were all lies. The two truths was that, and that he worked at a swimming pool, and that he was two truths he told, that he worked as a swimming pool, and that he was a conservative college student who did not oppose the Vietnam War. The only two true things he said. During the 1960s, Biden said, I was in fact very concerned about the civil rights movement. I was not an activist. I worked at an all-black swimming pool on the east side of Wilmington, Delaware. I was involved in what they were thinking, what they were feeling, but I was not out marching. I was not down in Selma. I was not anywhere near else. Anyway, I was not anywhere else. I was a suburbanite kid who got a dose of exposure to what was happening to black Americans. When he was pushed about false claims that he had also been against the Vietnam War, Biden also owned up to that and said, when I was at Syracuse, I was married, I was in law school, I wore sports coats. You're looking at a middle-class guy. I am who I am. I'm not big on flak jackets and tie shirts. You know, that's not me. So then, however, after his campaign, he repeated his lies later, after nearly losing his political career because of these lies. From 1987 until 2014, Biden appeared to refrain from telling any of these stories at all about his role in the civil rights movement. But suddenly, while giving a speech at a King Day breakfast in January 2014 for the National Action Network, Biden resorted back to the same old debunked lies and also added one brand new one that he had never told in his earlier life, saying that he was regularly trained for the civil rights movement in 1960 on Sunday mornings in black churches. Biden said, when I got involved in desegregation, I was no Big Shakes reverend in the civil rights movement. I got involved in desegregating movie theaters and helping you may remember Reverend Moyer in Delaware and Herman Holloway organized over voting registration drives coming out of black churches on Sunday, figuring out how we were going to move. And in Waterloo, Iowa, on this past Sunday, Sean King says, 2019, it's December 5th, 2019, Biden began telling falsehoods again about being an activist and organizer, and then adding new color to the lie from 2014 that he was being trained as an activist in black churches on Sunday mornings, saying, I got involved, most of you don't know me well, I got involved in public life because I was about the age of the guy standing over there, points to a teenage boy. I got involved in the civil rights movement. Utter lies, not just, Sean King says, utter lies, not just from his 1988 campaign, but he keeps repeating it. He's a pathological liar. Apparently itching for another scandal to end yet another presidential campaign, Biden continued his lies again, this time in a special service in the Bethlehem Baptist Church in Columbia, South Carolina, on this past January 20th, 2020. this year. Each time he tells these lies, he appears to be abandoning his script and adding new layers of lies on top of the old ones. Like he's almost incapable of telling the truth. So Biden said, when I was a teenager in Delaware, for real, I got involved in the civil rights movement. We have the 8th largest black population in America. Many people don't know that. And I go to 8 o'clock mass. Then I'd go to Reverend Herring's church, where we'd meet in order to organize and figure where we were going to go. Whether we were going to desegregate the Rialto movie theater or what we were going to do. I got my education, for real, in the black church. And that's not hyperbole. It's a fact. Well, it's not a fact. It's totally made up. Sean King mentions that none of this is true. It's utter bullshit. The Rialto Theater that Biden mentioned was a kind of famous theater. It had been desegregated several years before Biden's supposed activism. He got his dates wrong. In February of 2020, while campaigning in South Carolina's mostly black state, Biden claimed to have been arrested while trying to visit Nelson Mandela in South Africa, who was in prison at the time. At a Black History Conference in Las Vegas, I think it's just back around the same time, January, February this year. Biden claimed that when Mandela became president of South Africa, Mandela thanked him for this. After media criticism, Biden clarified, saying he was separated from his black colleagues. Andrew Young, UN ambassador, was there, and some other African-American congressmen or government officials. He clarified, we were separated from them. So it's another blatant lie. One more lie. His first wife, Nella, and his daughter Naomi were killed in a 1972 car crash. Killed his wife and his baby daughter, and by the worst moment of Joe Biden's life, and it was a bad thing, a tragedy. It's drawn renewed attention over falsehood that the former vice president repeated for years, that the other driver was drunk. From 2001 to 2007, Mr. Biden indicated at least twice that the tractor-trailer driver who hit his wife's car had been drinking, even though the state official who oversaw the investigation and the driver's daughter said that wasn't true. Basically, Biden's wife, Nella Biden, drove past a red light. I think a stop sign. She just drove. It was her fault. I mean, it's a tragedy. It's sad, but she was at fault for that accident. The driver who hit her was not drunk. During the 2008 presidential campaign, Pamela Harrell was the daughter of the driver, Curtis Dunn, called on Mr. Biden to apologize publicly after he told the crowd that her father drank his lunch before the accident, according to a 2008 article on the Newark, Delaware Post. So, a tractor-trailer guy who allegedly, and I never pursued it, drank his lunch instead of eating his lunch, broadsided my family, and killed my wife instantly, and killed my daughter instantly, and hospitalized my 2 sons, Biden said in 2007. In a 2001 speech at the University of Delaware, Biden referred to an errant driver who stopped to drink instead of drive, that my children and my wife hit my children and my wife and killed them. According to Inside Edition report, Dunn died in 1999. He was defended for years by his daughter, and his daughter movingly said, my father's not here to defend himself, so I'll do it for him. She was very loyal to his memory, and I could imagine this really devastated Dunn's life. He wasn't at fault for the accident, but Biden's lies ruined his life, I could imagine. And makes Joe Biden look like a bum. Look like a total, utter bum. Okay, women's issues. And I'm almost finished here. Women's issues. Okay, Biden sponsored the Violence Against Women Act of 1994. He wrote this. It was inserted in the horrible Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which ramped up mass incarceration. It's a common tactic of a small progressive nugget inserted in a draconian crackdown. And so Biden used that to look like he was defending women's rights. So this law prevented domestic abusers from crossing state lines. and to encourage police to get involved in domestic disputes. And I guess it's a good thing. I guess it's a good thing. But before President Bill Clinton signed the Violence Against Women Act into law as part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act on September 13, 1994, domestic abusers could cross state lines to avoid prosecution for beating their spouses, as law enforcement was not then required to listen to orders of protection filled in other states. Police officers were also generally discouraged from intervening in domestic violence cases. This marked a cultural change and inserted an otherwise horrible bill. So yeah, and then later they did a video with Lady Gaga. But there's a high irony in this, and I don't like anything which increases police powers, but it might be a good bill. And he did a video on crimes against women with Lady Gaga. Made him seem like it was a progressive in this issue, but the high irony, the Tara Reade case. So, and the Me Too movement, famous Tara Reade case, who accused Biden of basically, in fact, raping her. And the whole Me Too movement was scuttled. I believe, trust all women. During the Kavanaugh hearings, you trust what women say. And that was just scuttled by the Democratic Party. 7 other women besides Tara Reade accused him of, as far as I know, not rape, but of very inappropriate, basically sexual harassment. Okay, so it's a high irony there, and there are dozens and dozens of photos and videos of Biden publicly harassing women, young girls, sniffing their hair, inappropriate conduct over and over again. It's not endearing, it's creepy, it's extremely creepy. And he's been able to get away with it because he's a powerful guy. And probably the parents of the people involved, the kids involved, would hurt their career. So